welcome back from lunch and coffee, everyone. We'll continue now with a session we've titled Perspectives. In his opening remarks, Alf mentioned the current media situation in India and the troubled nature of that situation. So we're extremely happy to have what is in effect a keynote on what's happening to the media in India. We have a full 90 minutes for this session, which gives us plenty of time for both the presentation itself and for a subsequent discussion on this very important topic. We're also extremely happy to have with us Siddharth Varadarajan, who really needs no further introduction, but he will get one anyway. He's, as you know, a former editor of The Hindu and the founding editor of The Wire, one of the most important online news portals that's both editorially and financially independent. The CV is, of course, far too long to read out. He's been a visiting professor at the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley and a Poynter Fellow at Yale. And of course, the editor of one of the earliest and most comprehensive accounts of the 2002 Gujarat pogroms, a book titled Gujarat, Making of a Tragedy. So welcome, the floor is yours, and I'll be back once you're done to moderate the rest of the discussion.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I can be quite indisciplined as far as time goes, so maybe if I go beyond a certain point, then just let me know. Then I will try to wind down. Because when it comes to the media, there is really an enormous lot to be said, and I'm happy to have this opportunity at this conference. Thank you, Alf, for inviting me, and I will essentially take about 40-45 minutes to paint what I regard as a broad overview of the media landscape as it exists today, as it has evolved over the last decade and a half, and how the kind of coverage that we see today of political developments in the country is very closely linked to the manner in which the industry as a whole has evolved, and in particular its political economy, the political economy of its business model. That's what I will try to explain and analyze. And I will, in the latter half, try to deal with the question that has been bothering me and a lot of other journalists in India, which is that the diagnosis many of us make of the crisis of the Indian media being linked to corporate control, excessive dependence on advertising, profit-oriented media, holds more or less true, say, of the big media in the United States. Yet, big media in the United States is approaching the challenge of covering the Trump administration in ways that are very different from the way in which big media is handling the challenges of covering the Modi government. So what might some of the reasons for that be, notwithstanding the similarity or the superficial similarity in terms of underlying political economy? So I will offer some speculative thoughts on that, and then hopefully we can open the floor for discussion. So let's start with the fundamental question, which is, why are we talking about the state of the media in the first place? Before I became a journalist, I used to be an economist, and over the last 15, 20 years, I've attended lots of events of this kind that bring together essentially academic specialists on the politics or sociology or the history of India in order to analyze currently unfolding events from an academic perspective, or to find to trace out historical trajectories and so on and so forth. Very rarely has the media really figured as a topic of discussion. Neither during Rajiv Gandhi's time or Narasimha Rao or or Vajpayee's era either, though there are moments or there are elements of, you can trace the history of some of current media practice, some official current media practice back to the Vajpayee era, but I don't recall at that time. I was then at the Times of India, and I don't recall academic conferences or, focusing attention on the state of the media as an important element of discussion. And so clearly something has changed, and there is a perception among those who study India that perhaps an element of Indian democracy or Indian society that one took for granted, which was that the free, independent nature of media, with all its aberrations and problems, was something that you could rely on, something that you could, take as a given and look at other elements of, other changing elements of an equation, because the media more or less was a kind of constant. If it was bad in the 60s, it carried on being bad in the 70s or 80s. It's not as if new elements of badness or goodness crept in. So there was this idea of predictability, which meant that we weren't really looking at media except when it came to specific problems. So how is the media covered or contributed to communalization? So there would be discussions on that. But not any attempt to have a broad overview of the state of the media itself. And so this is new and is clearly a reflection of what those of us in the media see and perceive, but also those of you who are outside, as really an unprecedented level of pressure operating from within and without on the media in India. So these are very different, very unique times. Superficially, if you look at numbers, it may seem as if these are really the best of times for the Indian media. You have a large number of newspapers, TV channels, rising viewership and circulation. Now you have internet. Every day a new website or a new portal opens, not just in English or Hindi, but in different languages. Facebook, Twitter, social media use is exploding. The access of the ordinary citizen to different forms of media is unprecedented. The ability of people, citizens, to participate in some sort of a conversation with the producers of media is also unprecedented. So why, despite this, this idea of statistical buoyancy, do we speak in terms of pressure? And what is the nature and what is the kind of pressure that we perceive? I think that's really the fundamental question. Those of you who watch different private television channels will be familiar with a phrase that crops up frequently in, say, Republic TV or Times Now, which are the two largest English language television, news television channels. I say largest with a pinch of salt because we don't really have reliable data, but just judging by the amount of advertising that they carry as some sort of an indicator and their ability to move conversations on social media, they are clearly dominant players when it comes to English at least. And so the phrase that their anchors love using is, they speak of themselves as being outliers. In some ways rebels, in some ways those who are recapturing the kind of authentic media space from what they call disparagingly the Lutyens media. And they will mispronounce Lutyens as Lutyens and make a very poor pun to say that these are all looters. So Lutyens media. And the idea is that what they run down as mainstream or big media is, in their view, it's a compromised media. It's a media that has been in the payroll of the Congress party and the Gandhi family. And what they present as authentic, genuine journalism is essentially journalism which aims to speak for the voice of the nation. So you have a very explicitly articulated nationalist media voice. Again, this is something very new. Even during, the only, perhaps, the earlier shade of this that you would have encountered, and even then it was really quite momentary, was during the Kargil war, when in many ways private television came into its own. You had channels that vied with each other. They were able to send correspondents to the battle zone thanks to the Indian Army's willingness to take some of these people up there. And there was very heightened nationalist coverage, but it really lasted 2 or 3 months. And very soon channels moved on to other things. But this conscious packaging of yourself as nationalist media, that media which does not put India first, is not authentic, is not genuine media, is something that really is very, very new to the perhaps in 62 there would have been some of this, but I wonder to what extent it would have been so blatant and so in your face as we see now. And of course, electronic, television has a way of magnifying this entire discourse. So the right-wing media, which is essentially big media, the 2 biggest channels, and the Hindi channels which have a wider reach, actually also echo and speak in the same voice. So the largest Hindi channels, Aaj Tak, for example, or Z News, or India TV. So actually the largest probably India TV, and followed by Z, and then Aaj Tak in 3rd place. Also very consciously articulate. So Aaj Tak is interesting because it's part of Living Media Group, which runs India Today magazine. And India Today has, if you will, a split personality. So some of their anchors go down the ultra-nationalist path, others try to hew a more middle-of-the-road tone. But big Hindi media also has thrown all normal journalistic or editorial guidelines to the wind and revels in this idea of India first as being the guiding principle of their journalism. So this is the division that you have. The biggest media channels are the most vocal in running down anybody that is critical of the government, describing them as Lutyens media, Lutyens media, anti-national media. It's not uncommon for them now to take potshots at specific anchors, specific websites. When we ran a critical piece by Professor Partho Chatterjee in The Wire on the Human Shield incident, where a major of the Indian Army caught hold of a Kashmiri man who had just voted, as it turned out, and strapped him to the front of their jeep and drove him around. And so Partho Chatterjee kind of made a historical analysis of the language used to justify this kind of violation of human rights, and saw in the justification that the army chief made echoes of some of what General Dyer had said when he was asked about the Jallianwala Bagh. It was a very nuanced piece. The comparison was not between the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the Human Shield incident per se. But even if it was, it's a point of view of an academic, and that's where matters should rest. But you had instead a frenzy for 2 or 3 days with these channels chasing him, trying to put him on the spot, running him down as an illiterate, as an anti-national. All of this with the backing of, and with a green light given on Twitter by the Information and Broadcasting Minister, who picked this entire controversy up, I think, 72 hours after the piece was published. It was a kind of calculated move to try to whip up hysteria. So that's kind of the right-wing media, which is taking potshots at everybody else. And of course, you have critics of these channels and these newspapers who also, Arun Shourie has famously used the phrase North Korean channels. He describes Times Now, Republic as North Korean media because of the way in which they adulate the dear leader and treat all of his critics as enemies of the nation, enemies of the people. My sense after watching some of these channels, particularly over the last 2 months, is that North Korean is correct. I mean, there is a strong element of the North Korean approach, but there is also a strong element of Rwandan in the sense of actually inciting now, and I'm referring to the role played by Radio Milcolin and other Rwandan mass media outlets in the run-up to the genocide in the 90s, when now fairly well documented, it's well documented the manner in which you run down a minority, use pejorative terms, you kind of allow, you sort of invite public comment in the form of phone-ins or comments on. So the role that a phone-in played in early 90s Rwanda is played by social media today. But essentially, day after day, week after week, channels like Times Now and Republic TV are busy in constructing a strong anti-Muslim narrative. So issues, any news item that connects peripherally to the project of vilifying Muslims will occupy a primetime space on these channels. The format is predictable. You will have an angry anchor fulminating after a very, very tendentious 4 or 5 minute news clip is played, followed by studio commentators who are drawn allegedly to represent different points of view. But if it is, and as often these shows do include a so-called Muslim topic, then you will have so-called Muslim leaders from central casting, as it were, who play, who will provide the most obscurantist defense of allegations that these channels will mount. And you cannot come away after watching this show except to be filled with a sense of revulsion at, like you have to, in the sense that the entire idea is to vilify Muslims. So you will pick up a topic, present it in a tendentious way, have reactionary Muslim leaders who will then rise to the bait. And this happens day after day, which is why I feel that there is a narrative and there is a mindset being created, which is why I go with the Rwandan analogy also, and that some of these anchors, I'm sure you're familiar with, but bizarre topics will be entirely fabricated. There's a student from JNU who has been missing now for about a year, and first the time he was targeted by the ABVP shortly before his disappearance. We don't know whether that's the reason he disappeared or it's really a bit of a mystery. But the fact that the police haven't been able to find him is a subject of great concern in JNU and elsewhere in the country. And from time to time, to sort of diffuse the anger of students at the fact that one of their own has been missing and not been traced, various stories will be planted. So first, a story was planted in the Times of India as to how the browsing history of Najib that the police recovered from his computer showed that he was searching for ISIS. And this was a story that ran on the front page of Times of India. Completely fabricated story, a story that the police itself was forced to deny. And the paper published a tiny retraction way inside. But yet kept the story online. It didn't pull the online story version down. And that same story has been revived a few weeks ago with one of the channels claiming that he's actually gone to Syria. And all entirely without any basis. And then you will have a whole debate on how Indian Muslims are being seduced by ISIS. And the entire, and this happens night after night on these channels. And in terms of what these channels cover, what they don't, it's very clear that there is an attempt to drive media discourse in ways that the government would want media discourse to be driven. Issues or topics that are embarrassing to the government are consciously kept out. There was this amazing moment in one of these channels when the anchor was had assembled a panel to discuss, I think it was, why did one madrasa in Uttar Pradesh not sing Vande Mataram or something of that kind. And at some stage during the program, news broke about all these children dying in a hospital in Gorakhpur, and one of the guests said, I think that we should talk about the death of children in Gorakhpur. And the anchor got outraged and said, how dare you divert attention from the real issues? The real issue being, why did this one madrasa in Uttar Pradesh not sing Vande Mataram or whatever the topic was. So there is a sense in which you don't want to have debates or discussions on this. Major incident in Mandsaur 4 months ago when farmers were fired upon in Madhya Pradesh and killed. 6 of them died in one incident. Not a single channel broke into its programming to present this as breaking news, let alone have a debate that evening on a topic like this. So there is a sense in which content is being, it's very clear that the content on Indian television is being fashioned in a certain way. And why this is, the fact that, and this is now, people are beginning to notice, and I think that's part of the sense of alarm when we say what's happening to the Indian media. And I think it's to understand the manner in which topics get selected and how they get treated that we need to take a step back and ask ourselves a little bit about how the media in India actually is structured today, how do certain decisions get taken, and where is this pressure coming from that we see in different shapes and forms. And if I can just talk for a few minutes about different kinds of threats, different kinds of pressures, because I often get asked, people are always curious to know, if you look at the freedom of the press index, India does pretty poorly. I think it's 134 or 135. It slipped a few positions. And in many ways, this is surprising even for those of us in India because, we are conscious of how difficult the media environment is, not so much because of physical threats, although they also exist, but because of things that can't be measured or that are in many ways intangible. And yet, by any objective accounting of media freedom, which is what some of these specialized agencies do, India also scores badly. So there is the reality of that ranking. And the fact is, we've had two recent murders in the last month alone of Gauri Lankesh and Shantanu Bhaumik. Lankesh is an example of an editor killed for her views and her ideology. We don't know the identity of who killed her yet in terms of the conspirators or even the shooters, but we know who celebrated. We know the logic that they employed after she was killed. A BJP MLA from Karnataka even went so far as to say that had she not been critical of the RSS, she might have been alive today. And similar statements have come from these sorts of people. We don't know, as I said, this is still an open question, but it's clear that whoever targeted her because they didn't approve of what she was writing and what she was saying, and she was a very prominent personality in the politics and society of Karnataka. And the second example of Shantanu Bhaumik, which is equally disturbing because here is an example of a journalist, a reporter in Tripura, who was out covering a political rally. Tripura politics is interesting because this is one of 2 states still ruled by the Communist Party. And the BJP is determined to dislodge them one way or the other from Tripura. Earlier, Mamata Banerjee was considered to be the favorite to dislodge them, if at all. And now the BJP reckons it's in with a chance, also because it's growing very rapidly in West Bengal, and a large chunk of voters in Tripura are of Bengali origin. So you have a rally taking place in outside Agartala by a political group to whom the BJP is sympathetic. And a reporter covering the rally is attacked by members of that formation. The mob forms, he's killed on the job. And, this is, in recent memory, there have been shootings, assassinations, maybe beatings in a kind of mob situation. But in recent times, to come across an example of a journalist actually being killed on the job in this fashion, it's pretty rare and in a way is alarming. It speaks volumes for the kind of threats. So there are physical threats that are at one end of the whole continuum of threats that journalists face in India today. But beyond that, you have lots of other forms of pressure, which are exerted on the media by the government, by other players. In the Northeast, you have underground or insurgent groups that often browbeat or threaten editors and journalists to cover or not cover certain things. Similarly in Kashmir. So the physical threats are a problem, but beyond physical threats, you have, if we were to start by looking at official forms of pressure, the misuse of investigating agencies by the government. So the recent raid on NDTV, the promoter of NDTV, Prannoy Roy, by the Central Bureau of Investigation. A very, very flimsy case based on a private complaint filed many years ago of potential loss caused to a private bank by discounting a loan that NDTV had taken. You would imagine that this is hardly an issue that the CBI ought to get into, but the CBI got into it, and pursuant to its sudden investigations, they raided the house of Prannoy Roy. And the idea really was to send a very clear signal to not just NDTV and Prannoy, but any other media organization that was, that is not falling in line in terms of reporting events exactly the way the government wants. Because those of you who watch media in India know that NDTV is the one channel where you have some amount of criticism of the government, and in a fairly consistent manner, a refusal to simply toe the official sequence of events. Recently, when so NDTV is, the government had tried about 6 months ago to close down the channel for one day, the Hindi channel, NDTV India, again on very flimsy grounds, and the rest of the media fraternity united and put pressure on the government. They had to back away. So NDTV has been a consistent target, and now, of course, there is news of the channel being bought over by a businessman who is, close, not just close, he was an active member of the Bharatiya Janata Party's 2014 election strategy and has served in the past as an officer on special duty for Pramod Mahajan. So, and he owns SpiceJet, so he's a kind of a big corporate player. And there is talk of NDTV, whose financial position is somewhat parlous, being bought over by Ajay Singh. So perhaps what the government couldn't accomplish through raids and intimidation will be easier done through this. So, but nevertheless, the use of official agencies remains a threat. I mentioned echoes of what is happening today in terms of what was the state of play when BJP was last in power. You will recall when Tehelka broke the story of corruption and arms deals through their sting operation. Shortly after, the promoters of Tehelka, which was then a website, were raided, and a whole bunch of cases were foisted on them. Nothing came of those cases finally, but the kind of harassment that the promoters were subjected to ensured that the website collapsed and died. And that happened during the time Vajpayee was Prime Minister. So there is, in a way, a precedent for this kind of pressure and harassment. And from what we've seen, this government certainly will not shy away from using or misusing investigating agencies, income tax authorities, and various other bodies as a way of putting pressure. Apart from the physical attacks, apart from raids, you have officially sanctioned trolling as a means of. This is again something quite new in the media. Perhaps even 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we wouldn't have had to deal with this kind of problem. But you have a phalanx or an army of people active on social media, many of whom are actually affiliated to a part of IT cells of the ruling party, and who are pushed out in an organized and orchestrated fashion to go after particular individuals, or to when a particular news item is trending, to somehow intervene in Twitter and get an opposite trend to supersede that. And many of these people resort to the targeted abuse and harassment of journalists who are seen as critical of the government. Recently, there was an expose done by Alt News, which is one of the websites in India that actually is dedicated to exposing fake news and a lot of some of these hidden, the manner in which IT and social media is misused by the government. So Alt News reported how one of the guys who has been targeting Ravish, who was a leading anchor and an independent-minded journalist for NDTV India, the Hindi channel, how this chappie is actually linked to the BJP in Gujarat, is somebody who is followed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Twitter, and has relations with Amit Shah, with other BJP ministers. So there's a sense in which, and earlier too, evidence had surfaced, for example, when some of these people celebrated on Twitter the murder of Gauri Lankesh, and it turned out that they were, again, being followed by the Prime Minister. So one can argue, okay, fine, Prime Minister is not responsible for the tweets of those he follows, but one wonders, I mean, in no other democratic country would you have a situation like this where the head of state would openly follow or be even remotely associated with these kinds of Twitter handles. And yet, Mr. Modi has this kind of relationship with them. Once in a while, I think on two occasions, he's invited people who he follows on Twitter to the Prime Minister's office for a cup of tea. So there is a sense in which a lot of this harassment and trolling of media and media personalities has sanctioned from the very top. You, in addition, have the use of criminal defamation and the IT Act, the potential use of these laws. India is, again, perhaps the last of the democracies in the world to still have criminal defamation on its statute books. There was a move to have it struck down, which the Supreme Court didn't accept last year. And the, essentially criminal defamation, which adds an additional layer beyond civil defamation, is a lever that politicians use, private companies use, various other powerful individuals are able to use in order to lean on journalists, in order to lean on media. The IT Act, so far the government hasn't used the IT Act openly against any media portal yet, but the manner in which police agencies across the country are interpreting or misinterpreting the provisions of the IT Act. For example, Article 66 was famous, right? This was the section, Section 66 was famous of the IT Act. This was the section which allowed the police to arrest those two women in Bombay after Bal Thackeray's death, when they said that Bombay is quiet not because people are sad, but because they've been forced to mourn the death of Thackeray. So that section, which was worded in a very elastic way, was read down by the Supreme Court and essentially struck off. But Section 67 remains, which prohibits the electronic transmission of obscene or lascivious material, quote unquote. And since there isn't really any definition in the IT Act for what is obscene and what is lascivious, now there is a sense in which we know what this means. Material that is calculated to deprave. These are, again, vague terms, but there are legal precedents for what these terms mean in practice. But the police have interpreted lascivious or obscene material to include morphed photographs of leaders, to include poems that are derogatory and which may, had they been printed in a magazine or in a newspaper, might not have, but would certainly not fall foul of the law. Let me put it that way. They've used this to criminalize or attempt to criminalize people who've posted things on Facebook. They've attempted to charge people for liking things on Facebook, for tweeting, for retweeting. So there's a sense in which the IT Act is still provides the police with the ability to harass people on social media. So far, the bulk of their targets have been individual social media users, but it's very clear that by defining and treating the law in this elastic fashion, in the future, this could easily be used to go against electronic or digital media platforms as well. You then have the use of advertising by the government as a way of penalizing media outlets. In Kashmir, for example, Kashmir Times, which is a critical, independent-minded newspaper published from Jammu, has been denied, and this is not with this government alone, for the last 10, 15 years, simply because they report human rights violations. They don't report in a stenographic fashion what the police or what the army say. So Kashmir Times has been denied any official advertising. So, say the government is acquiring land, or there are certain statutory ads that they are required to put in the newspapers, and they will not give ads to Kashmir Times, which is a major blow to these papers which subsist on advertising for their revenue. And this is, this may not matter to national level newspapers like the Times of India or the Hindu, but at the state level, to starve a newspaper of public advertising is essentially to make them financially unviable. And this is also a lever that the governments use to put pressure. If we move away from official forms of pressure, you have the increasing use of slaps, strategic lawsuits against public participation. Josie Joseph of the Hindu wrote a book on Jet Airways and was slapped with the 100 crore defamation suit by Mr. Naresh Goyal and Jet Airways. We at The Wire have three cases against us, one by Adani for 100 crore in a Bhuj court, 2 lawsuits by Rajiv Chandrasekhar, who was this weapons manufacturing member of parliament who was part of NDA, part of the National Democratic Alliance. 2 cases from him, each worth 20 crore in a court in Bangalore. And one civil cum criminal defamation case by Subhash Chandra, who was an MP and head of the Z Group, which is itself a media company. So we have a case from him in a court in Aizawl, Mizoram, which is, I think he wants 10 crore in damages. So this is all, and these are all frivolous cases that we will fight and we will defeat. But the idea is that you embroil the media, you threaten, you browbeat, you bully. Paranjoy Gohar Thakurta, when he wrote, who was incidentally for the Adani case also, so he as a result of the article he wrote for Economic and Political Weekly, which cost him his job. So we reran that article in The Wire, so the case is against Paranjoy and us. But Paranjoy earlier, when he wrote a book on the fight between the 2 Ambani brothers called The Gas Wars, it was a self-published book. And he again received threats of a lawsuit, which finally the Ambanis didn't translate into an actual case. But oftentimes it's the threat of, as we saw in the case of EPW, that the very idea of sending a legal threat is enough to get people to back down. And we're seeing increasingly the use of these kinds of lawsuits by large corporates, which is emerging as a serious form of pressure. Caravan magazine is another independent publication that has been harassed by these kinds of cases in the past and continues to be so. But beyond the external forms of pressure, which are pressure that the government can exert, pressure that private companies exert, it's really the internal. I don't want to. It's important that we not exaggerate the extent to which the rot in the Indian media today is externally imposed. There's an element of external imposition. There's an element of fear of what the government or private companies, big companies can do. But a lot of what is rotten, a lot of what is bad is something that has essentially been generated from within media organizations themselves. And I think understanding this is key to dealing with or analyzing the current position and the future trajectory of the Indian media. And it's really I will throw at you 3 or 4 examples of, from the last month, literally, or last 2 months, of things that are wrong with, internally, that have to do with, of course, a combination of, there is external pressure or external suggestion that operates too, but what is it that makes the largest media houses in the country accept suggestions or accept pressure or accept things that the government or somebody outside would say? The recent termination of the Hindustan Times editor's job, for example, Bobby Ghosh, brought to India with a lot of fanfare literally a year ago, or a year and a half ago by the Hindustan Times proprietor, and essentially terminated at very short notice by Shobana Bhartiya. The decision to ask him to leave came shortly after the meeting she had with the Prime Minister, where we know from our sources, and we wrote about this, the issue of Hindustan Times' coverage and Bobby Ghosh's citizenship, which is an alibi that the government was using because there is no illegality involved in a foreign editor editing a newspaper. They know it. But nevertheless, this was raised as an issue. And Shobna Bhartiya, essentially went along, and the newspaper got rid of him. Times of India recently, lots of examples of stories being pulled down. It's not clear that, from where instructions come or a demand comes, but there was a story that they ran recently in their Jaipur edition, which was which showed the Prime Minister's insurance scheme for farmers in bad light. It's called the Pradhan Mantri Kisan Bima Yojana, and it essentially showed how the scheme was not working and that farmers were getting ripped off. The story runs in the Jaipur edition of the Times of India. It's liked enough within the internal editorial structure for the Delhi paper to want to run the story. So they asked for changes and improvements so that they will run it in the Delhi edition. And then what happens is that the story never runs in Delhi. Not only does it not run in Delhi, it is pulled down from the website. It vanishes. And queries to editors as to why this happened draw a blank. Nobody is willing to take responsibility. And it's not as if this hasn't happened in the past. This has happened before. There was recently a leak of a WhatsApp message in which showed how the executive editor of the Times of India was lobbying with the finance minister to have an income tax official posted abroad. And the question arises that if the editor of Times of India has a comfort level with the finance minister to demand or to lobby for posting for somebody abroad, you wonder what kind of leverage or what kind of comfort operates the other way around. So we presume the finance minister also feels comfortable enough to say, move that story, move this guy, kill that story, etc. So it's, again, when we raise these things in the public domain, there's never been a tradition of any public discussion of these sorts of things, but at the Wire, we don't, we don't balk at these sorts of things. So we've been writing about it, and we actually asked the Times of India's proprietor, the HT's proprietor, and editors, please give an explanation for this, and they don't have explanations for it, and they just prefer not to answer. But what is it that makes big media houses, right? We're talking, Times of India is a company that has a bottom line of probably 1,500 crore. It's a massive company. The English language Times of India is the largest circulating English paper in the world. They have a near monopoly in print, on television, radio, because they own Radio Mirchi. They have interests in the movie business. What is it that would make Times of India or Hindustan Times, which is also a large player, vulnerable in this way? Why would a Dainik Jagran, which is a Hindi paper, big Hindi paper, why would they want to consciously break the law during the Uttar Pradesh elections and run an opinion poll when the law says you can't, that shows BJP leading? What is it that would want to make them run these kinds of risks? What is it that would want to make them curry favor with the government or with the ruling party? This is really the fundamental question, and it has to do, in my view, with the nature of the business model and the fact that the business model of Indian media, of big Indian media, is breaking down in ways that are very, very damaging to editorial integrity. And in a nutshell, that business model consists of not wanting to charge readers or viewers anything for the product, for the news that they consume, and to collect the entire revenue. So you pay for your media expenses, your news gathering expenses, and your delivery expenses, not by charging readers a fee or a subscription price or anything of that sort, but by collecting advertising. And when advertising is not, so this is the model around the world, except that in the West, newspaper revenues perhaps rarely dipped below 60%. If we look at subscriptions, maybe 50-50. In India, in the 50s, we know from a study that a parliamentary committee conducted that advertising was about 50-55% of revenue. Today, advertising for newspapers constitutes 95 to 96%. If you consider that the cost of producing each copy of the paper is more than what they are able to recover from a sale. So in other words, there's a negative marginal revenue. They lose 15 rupees for every copy they sell, actually. The contribution of advertising is probably 120 or 130% of revenue. So you're essentially recouping your expenses through advertising, and this obviously has an impact on your coverage because it gives advertisers a disproportionate say. But as media turns increasingly digital, which is what is happening, even in a market like India, which is a late entrant into digital media, but the speed with which things are changing, smartphone ownership and penetration, data plans. I think 2 or 3 years from now, because of Reliance Jio, 3G or 4G is going to be the norm across for most owners of smartphones, and they will be 80 to 90% of the population. So just as in the telecom space, people move from having no telephone to having a mobile phone, right? So there was the bulk of people skipped the landline phase. Bulk of Indian media consumers will skip the phase of reading newspapers, I dare say even watching TV, and will be consuming media entirely digitally and entirely on their phone. And whatever the wider sociological implications of this, let's leave that aside. But what this means for the revenue of news companies is something very, very dramatic, because advertising yields, when it comes to the amount of real estate you have on a mobile phone, tend to be very, 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 very low. So the idea that a company like Times of India could generate enough advertising revenue from mobile phone advertising, enough to pay for the news gathering expenses of its vast empire, seems very hard to stomach. They will not be able to do it. And this is forced, and newspapers, big media houses know that they have to move away and look for other sources of revenue. And what they tend to do is to get involved in businesses that are outside of media. Times of India has been doing this for a long time. They have something called MediaNet initially, which was a form of trading news space, favorable news space for money. And that has evolved now to something called private treaties, where they sign essentially equity deals. So if you're a large advertiser, let's say you are a company like India Bulls, which started off as stockbroker and then got into real estate. So a company like India Bulls will sign a deal with Bennett Coleman for coverage, for advertising. Officially, it'll be for advertising, in exchange for which Times of India will pick up a small stake in India Bulls. And there may or may not be unwritten understandings about favorable coverage. We saw a recent example of an Economic Times editorial on the scandals surrounding a private builder called the JP Group. Now, this is a group that has been quite close to the BJP in the past and even now, and has several housing projects around Delhi where they've essentially ripped off middle-class buyers by collecting money up front and not delivering on the flats that they promised to build, and no hope of delivering either. And then they went and, of course, the entire project was being done by a subsidiary, which then declared bankruptcy. It had no other assets, so the prospective flat owners were left high and dry. They went to court. The Supreme Court, in a rare decision, essentially told the company that we are going to hold all your affiliated companies also to account. So you cannot insulate yourself just by declaring bankruptcy of this one company. So you have Economic Times writing an editorial criticizing the Supreme Court for this judgment. And then it turns out that JP Group is one of the groups of which Economic Times has a private treaty. So Times owns 1 or 2% in various subsidiary companies of the JP Group. So you have these kinds of conflicts of interest, which are very much part of the media landscape now. And to pretend that this does not affect coverage is really to live in a fool's paradise. I want to, since I have 5 minutes left, just address the question that I threw at you before I started, which is that. Sorry, before I do that, what what this, the increasing tendency for Indian media companies to have secondary or tertiary business interests is not only because they are looking for additional sources of revenue and profitability at a time when advertising is being squeezed, but this also makes them vulnerable to not only changes in the economy, because if you are, say, Jagran and you have a power company, or if you're Bennett Coleman, so one of the reasons why the Times of India group is exposed today, or is vulnerable, is because they have a large project in Uttar Pradesh called Bennett University, a private university to be built on land that has been given to them by the Uttar Pradesh government. It was given by the previous government, but there is a fear that all clearances haven't been granted, so they're dreading the prospect of Yogi Adityanath one day writing them a letter saying that, well, you didn't get your environmental clearance done yet, and you forgot to ask these villagers for their clearance, so we're stopping your project. So there's, essentially these secondary and tertiary interests that you develop leaves you completely open to forms of pressure that governments like to exert, because they say we're not targeting Times of India, we are targeting Bennett University. The more exposed you are as a media company in terms of other interests, the greater likelihood that you are going to face pressure or be vulnerable to pressure from the government. But I want to address this question that I started with, which is that, okay, so all of these things, all of these ills that I've described in one way or the other, private ownership, dependence on advertising, all of this exists in the US too, to lesser or greater degree. So why is it that the US media has been much more aggressive and more independent in dealing with the Trump administration than the Indian media? And I want to offer two or three hypotheses. First, it is my sense that if you look at Trump versus Modi in terms of wider political economy at the national level, the US corporate sector is really very divided. And if at all there is a consensual position in the corporate sector, it would be that Trump is pretty much bad news. And even if that's not a consensual position, but a major section of US industry would be reacting very, very negatively to the Trump phenomenon, to his election, to his policies. And that, to my mind, creates a comfort zone for big media to echo those concerns. In India, if you look at how Modi got elected, there was near unanimity among all big, and I wrote about this in a seminar in 2014, about the shift from the Congress to the BJP that we saw from 2012 onwards of all your big Indian companies, big corporate sector. And that, even though there is irritation in some sectors today with the whimsicality of some of his decisions, demonetization, for example, but broadly speaking, Indian corporate India is still sold on the idea that Modi is the best solution for the Indian economy. And I think that this acts as a dampener for at least the plurality of views in the Indian media, and certainly for the appetite of media companies to do certain kinds of stories or to have certain kinds of debates. Second, state institutions in the United States, which have evolved with a fair degree of autonomy and integrity over 200 years, where today it's much more difficult for, when Trump is pushing a certain agenda item, there are lots of areas where he's facing pushback. So you can have a decision on prohibiting the entry of Muslims from different countries. The first point of pushback came from within the State Department. It's a different matter that they were overruled. But in India, you have a situation where, and we wrote about this 2 days ago, the MEA puts out a book to celebrate Deen Dayal Upadhyay. And this has never happened. An unsigned book where they say that BJP is the only alternative for India, and where there's a facile equation of Hinduness with Bhartiyata. And when we approached retired IFS people, that look, you need to take a stand on this. And so these are people with they retired 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and out of the 15 people we contacted, only 3 or 4 people were willing to speak. So that lack of institutional, autonomy or pride, or what have you, which I think when it comes to the functioning, say, of investigative agencies in India, so the CBI is very, very unlikely if it receives an instruction from the government that you go after NDTV. The CBI is completely unlikely to say no, we won't, or to wonder about the legality or the implications or a future probe by somebody. Unlike in the United States, where these things are much more they're more hard to effect directly. So I think that the nature of state institutions and the way in which investigative agencies, the courts, the pushback against Trump's entry program came from a court in, I think, Washington State and then in Hawaii. In India, you'd be lucky to have a pushback only at the Supreme Court level, or maybe High Court of Bombay and Delhi. And even then, the government has, so you had 2 years ago, Justice Shakdar in the Delhi High Court, who said that the government's attempt to stop a Greenpeace activist from going to the UK, Priya Pillai, that this decision to stop her was illegal. 2 months later, this judge is transferred from Delhi High Court and sent off to Madras. So the levers of, the executive's ability to manage every state institution, I think also becomes a factor which makes it more likely that the media would prefer to keel over and go along with the program of the ruling party than to contest it. And the last point really, and again, this doesn't make me very happy to say this as an Indian journalist, but I think that the level of institutional integrity within media organizations is very low. The degree of professionalism, the degree to which people take pride in journalism as a craft, and I would be willing to stand up to dodgy instructions given by an owner or an editor. I think that is also something which separates US journalism today from Indian journalism, which is why I believe, despite many of the negative political economy factors operating in both countries, what we see in India is much less of a fight, much less of a challenge. And it's not a surprise that the challenge or the pushback to, at least on the reporting front, on the news front, is coming from smaller players making use of the internet, making use of digital storytelling, and the fact that you don't need the reason we started The Wire as an online portal was because there are no entry barriers. So with virtually no investment, one can be up and running, and it becomes that much more difficult for somebody to tamp down on that coverage. So maybe digital, maybe social media, maybe these are the avenues through which the Indian media will find and amplify its voice in the coming months and years. But as of now, based on trends, underlying trends of political economy and the business nature of the business model, the outlook as far as big media is concerned is not at all very optimistic. Thank you.
Good, thank you so much. The floor is open immediately for questions and comments. Anand, we have a microphone. Perhaps you'd take control of that. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's just recording.
Oh, it's just recording, right?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Siddharth. You're always, you're always very analytical, but you're lately getting more and more depressing, but for good reason. But the question I have is this. It seems at some level, you talk about how it used to be and how we had an impression of a media that wasn't this way. And then you describe the sort of, in great detail, both the mediocrity, the selling out, the terror, all of the various elements that you described. So at some level, I think, what does it mean to think about an open media, an open, freer, healthy media that existed in India at some point, and boom, you have the absolute opposite, right? So it's hard to actually understand that transition unless you, can you trace for us a little bit sort of what institutional weaknesses you think, could have led to this? Because otherwise it just seems such a reversal in your story.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say the two institutional weaknesses that have developed over the last 20 or 30 years. One is on the economic side, which is the manner in which the business model, the underlying business model of media has, is primarily responsible actually, because it stands to reason that if the more you are dependent on just your readers, right, as for your money making, the greater is the likelihood that you will be loyal and responsive to them and to them alone, and be able to withstand pressures that force you to move away from that, right? So the fact is that over the last 20 years, Indian media houses have become less and less dependent and hence less and less accountable to their readership and viewership. And it's other interests that are essentially, that have crowded in and on whom media is financially dependent. So this is not something which happened after 2014. It's been happening for a longish period of time. And I mentioned the Times of India group and the evolution of some of its business practices with MediaNet, which is a form of paid news. So all of this has made media vulnerable. And I think the current setup has managed to latch onto those and use those vulnerabilities in a very efficient manner. And the second institutional factor is the changing nature of, when I say that Indian media institutions lack internal integrity, right? So you'd be hard pressed to find a full-fledged editor in any media organization today. And by a full-fledged editor, I mean somebody who is responsible for deciding what gets covered, how it will get covered, who will cover it, and what kind of resources will be devoted to covering it, right? So this has been the case now for the last 15 or 20 years, where the Times of India did away, so the editor lost the autonomy to make hires, to decide. I mean, I remember when I wanted to, back in 1999, I had an invitation to speak at a conference in The Hague. And this was when NATO was bombing Yugoslavia. And I told my editor that, look, I'm going to The Hague anyway. So, Budapest is a train journey away, and then by road to Belgrade, and I'll spend a week there, cover the war for us. Hardly cost, total, I said, I'll do the whole thing within $800 or $1,000. That's hardly 40,000 rupees. He was excited. He said, great. But then he said, wait, I have to, this is something only the boss. So a decision to spend $800 had to be cleared by Vineet Jain, who's the owner of the company. And that was, Times of India. And there are lots of other examples of, and this is something quite harmless. I mean, when it comes to contentious stories or difficult issues, editors have ceded ground or never had that ground, never had that space in the first place. So I think that all of this has made things much easier. So you don't have, there is no one editor who takes pride in what goes into her paper and is able to take a stand and say, look, this is not allowed, or I will not air this. And decisions, again, this is anecdotal, but shortly after Amit Shah was cleared by a CBI court in the Sohrabuddin and Kausar B murder case, I'm talking now December 2014, I recall calling up a friend of mine who was actually high up in the channel, and I said, look, we should have a discussion on this. And he scheduled a discussion, and management cancelled it. And management was able to cancel it because that's the way these companies are structured, and that's the way they've been for the last 10, 15 years. So I think that what has happened they've taken it. I think this government has taken advantage of what has evolved. So to that extent, it's not sudden, But even so, what they are doing is really quite new. Like nobody in the past took things to such an extent where a story after it is published vanishes from a website. Like we're collecting these things. We have like 6-7 examples in the last 3 years. And this never happened before. And I mean, I've been in the media for 15, 16 years. We never saw this degree of control from outside. I mean, I presume this is outside because nobody will say where or who is doing this. But the fact that they can get away with this and there's no disquiet within these organizations tells you how deep the rot is.
Good. I have many people on my list, so we'll collect a few questions. First Subir, then Srila, and then Sunil.
Yeah, my question. Thanks. I think what you just said partly answers one of my questions, which is, was this not an earlier moment, late 80s, early 90s, when the editors ceded control over to management for the kind of decisions? But also, I mean, to what extent is this actually quite Modi-specific, in the sense that if you look at him from 2007-8 within Gujarati media, then you have Dainik Bhaskar, Dainik Jagran, Economic Times, HT, they all kind of begin to talk quite a lot about the Modi model, the Gujarat model. And in fact, even NDTV in 2012, 13, etc., they gave a free pass on the Gujarat model, as if it was an already established thing. I've watched programs there when, it was just taken for granted that this is the best model in the country. And I've not really found a very satisfactory answer as to why the switch happened before even Modi came to power and before some of the dynamics that you're talking about, happened. And in addition to news media, you also have, I mean, right now, in fact, while checking, Twitter during the break, I find that you now have a time traveler who is telling the news channel, India Today, India TV, sorry, Z India, he is doing a sort of seance to find where Honeypreet is, okay? So the degree of irrationality, that your mainstream television channel now has Ashwathama comes to this temple, that kind of thing, or the religious channels like Astha or Sanskar, which have all the Babas who are also political Babas, it kind of creates a much wider spectrum for Hindutva politics to unfold than if we were just talking about the news channels. So do you see that as at all relevant, which is that it's not just the news channels which are doing, Kaun banega crorepati? Now there are 10 questions to do with recognize this voice, this is Smriti Irani's voice, okay? Which BJP chief minister is known as Mama, etc. So you have a much deeper kind of cultural politics supporting the BJP than just the news channels. And I'm just wondering if you want to comment on that as well.
Srila?
Thanks. So just a small question about the role of social media in all this, because obviously one assumes that social media is playing a very, very important, essential, productive role. But I just saw a recent report that suggested, and I think I've seen this elsewhere, that actually internet usage in India is far more overstated. And maybe, I think it said it's only 13% in terms of the rural population. So I just wondered if you could comment on that.
I found your comparison between the U.S. and India quite provocative in a certain way. And in a certain way, 2014, was at the sort of forefront of what we get in Brexit and then Trump coming later. And a lot of commentators have focused on this sort of fundamental irrationality of this. So I'm wondering, how important are emotions to what journalists do or what journalists should be doing and what they are doing, and how has it become more of a sort of integral to the way people experience media, whether it's social media or television, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's my question about emotions, basically.
Should I answer this one? Yeah. Okay. The internet penetration, that's a good question. We don't really have hard data on this. I mean, there are different. One figure says 300 million, one figure says 400 million. Most of the figures that have these large numbers, most of this data that has large numbers like 300, 400 million, have a very, the definition of an internet user is somebody who may have visited a web page once in the month, once in the past month kind of a thing, right? So I would say the figures are, in terms of regular internet usage, maybe 60 to 80 million. But the problem with this figure is, and it used to be said in Indonesia a few years ago that internet meant Facebook, right? People did not know what is internet. They knew Facebook. They said, if you asked them, are you on the internet? They said no, but they were all on Facebook because they had, essentially free basics, and so they had easy access to Facebook. In India, it's not Facebook, it's WhatsApp. So in other words, a lot of people with even with a smartphone and even a 2G connection are able to access content which is it's not exactly SMS. So it is, some of these are links that you click on, but even if you don't, you can get a whole video which is 8 megabyte long, which you can download quite easily. So it's very hard to define content now as that this is internet, this is not internet. And I would say that if we include WhatsApp in internet coverage, internet use, the numbers are probably pretty large. And there is anecdotal evidence from kasbahs and small towns of WhatsApp messages playing havoc actually with at a local level. So we know at least of 2 recent communal flare-ups, one in West Bengal, one in Uttar Pradesh, where and I think the Uttar Pradesh one involved a flare-up in a village that stemmed from a WhatsApp message that a local guy had posted somewhere in Maharashtra. So there are interesting ways in which the boundaries of geography have been erased, but it's not quite. People aren't going. They're not using Twitter or Facebook, but just a WhatsApp message. So I would say that the impact is great and it's going to increase. And I wouldn't say that we're going to have reliable numbers, but it's fair to assume that even in rural areas today, you have digital quote-unquote information that is being disseminated. And we know from the BJP's electoral strategy that they are looking to use mobile data, mobile telephony, and the use of WhatsApp groups to send their message far and wide. So I think the penetration is is quite large. The question on Subir's question, you see, 2012, prior to 2014, every single channel, media was central to the BJP's campaign because the great victory of Modi was to erase the idea that he was twiddling his thumbs while genocide was happening in his state, and I'm being charitable here. So to erase that idea and to instead have this idea that he's a great, because that what could be a worse example of administration, right? Then you're a CM and 1,200 people or 2,000 people get killed in your state. And I'm not even talking about your personal involvement or allegations of personal involvement. So somehow that image of being what should have been an example of terrible administration gets transformed into Gujarat model, and the entire media was complicit in this, including NDTV. Because as I said, there was consensus among Indian big business that we are sick and tired of Manmohan. And my analysis of this really has to do with, corruption in Manmohan's time was not that they did not favor big business and Modi is favoring them, but that it was so chaotic and disorganized that they were cherry picking who among the big companies would benefit and who wouldn't. So in 2G is a classic case. So Unitech, 2-3 companies get cherry picked for getting the best benefits out of it. That created a huge amount of resentment among the rest of the telecoms players. So for a variety of reasons, the entire big Indian sort of business class switched loyalties and said we want Modi, and the media reflected that. So this idea of Gujarat model being a great thing was sold by them. Modi's media practice, what is specific about Modi is disdain for the media, refusal to engage, so he will not take questions, he will not put himself in a position where you will ever be able to throw an unscripted question at him. And so that's what, they used to attack Manmohan Singh as Mohan Singh, silent, a man who's silent. Manmohan Singh, in the 10 years he was PM, addressed 3 large formal press conferences at Vigyan Bhavan, and innumerable chota or minor press conferences on his aeroplane on the way back from all his foreign trips when he took journalists with him. So he must have been in at least 50 or 60 situations that you could call press conferences. Modi has avoided even one. And for him, it's strictly one-way communication. And, you have to say it's working for him, because even when, the journalists, there was this horrible picture a few years ago when journalists got to celebrate Diwali with him. And instead of using that opportunity to ask questions, they were all taking selfies with the guy, right? So this is unfortunately, this is the situation. So this is, Modi, that's the way he handles media. The question you asked about the wider cultural politics and these channels, I mean, we've always had superstition being purveyed through in the garb of news. India, Raja Sharma's India TV would often have bhoot pret and, ghosts and marriage of Nag or Nagin ki ka vivah, all the rubbish like this. So I don't, I don't know to what extent this, I mean, sociologists in the audience would be better placed to analyze what that does for, mass culture. But you've had equivalents, people have traced some of the Hindutva, frenzy to Ramanand Sagar's Ramayana and Doordarshan. I don't know how valid that is or not, but what is certainly true is that apart from the obvious superstition and mumbo jumbo, a lot of anchors, like, during demonetization, top channels floated this nonsense about how the 2,000 rupee note has a microchip in it, which even if you bury in, under 80 feet of earth, the satellite will be able to identify, and how brilliant this is of Modi. So, a lot of fake news is being put out, and I find that more alarming. I mean, so this is an example of crazy fake news. But the Times Now kind of fake news, where they pick up on, they'll say, we've received an audio clip of something, and they'll play this clip. You don't know what its provenance is. And later on, it may turn out to be completely fabricated. But they will have a whole 2 days discussion as to how Muslims are so bad. And I think that's what is particularly troubling. And I'm sure this has an impact in terms of making the, in terms of poisoning the atmosphere. And Sunil, your question on how important are emotions, I didn't follow US media coverage very closely during the campaign. But what I find problematic about Indian big media today, and particularly these right-wing nationalist channels, is that they have erased any difference between views and news. And I find this problematic even in print. That I think that every reporter or editor has her opinion, and she's entitled to it, or he's entitled to it. But there's a way that you express it. And certainly in a news report, keeping adjectives out, if at all you're providing perspective, sourcing that perspective properly. These are all, part and parcel of professional journalism. And all of these principles have been thrown to the wind in the channels that I named, and others like them. And so I find this deeply problematic, that when the journalist gets carried away and emotional / editorializing, as opposed to simply presenting basic facts.
I've just got a paper out on the same topics. I've just sent it to everyone.
Okay.
And also I'll be speaking a lot about this kind of thing. Please take copies.
Good. There's time for one last and final round of questions and comments. First, Anu, and then Katinka, Ajanta.
Can I ask?
You as well? Okay, in that case and Kavita.
I'll give very short answers.
Okay, and very short questions, please. Thank you.
I could ask quickly. I guess it goes off. It's 2 quick questions. I'll ask them very quickly. So first, regarding the US, I wonder if the more interesting or useful comparison would be with the period after 9/11 and the run-up to the Iraq War, when media revenues were at it was as flush as it had ever been, but they completely rolled over for Bush. Everyone's forgotten this now, but including the New York Times, the New Yorker, everyone supported Bush and the war. In terms of American media autonomy and state autonomy, because all these sort of state agencies rolled over for Bush at that time as well. Second, thank you for the very useful analysis of sort of the changing financial models of the media houses, it's very useful to think about what's going on. But it occurs to me that none of this would matter so much if these newspapers and magazines weren't so, newspapers and TV channels, sorry, weren't so popular. If Republic TV and Times Now and the Times of India weren't the most watched and read. So I just wonder if you could speculate about why they're more popular than The Wire, The Hindu, or NDTV.
I think my question takes off from Anand's a little bit. So I think, you know, you've presented a very dark, depressing, I think, as Raka said, vision of what's going on, and we're all very concerned about it. But I also want to take you back to that moment where you said that Republic TV and so forth think of themselves as outliers. And the fact that there has been a kind of expansion, and I just want to ask you about sort of English language media as opposed to, you know, media in other languages, and the way in which there has also been a very different kind of public sphere that one is contending with now. So there's a way in which, you know, English language media has to account for a kind of detour and then come back and, in a sense, process what's gone on. And maybe that's part of the you know, that's what stands behind these last two questions about affect and passionate attachments, but also, you know, how to explain this kind of popularity, because it seems to me that, and this is not perverse, I do want to say that, you know, if the people, which is what we've been talking about, is this kind of category that's a placeholder, well, the people can also be regressive, and the people can also react, and the people also have a completely different either non-democratic or non-liberal understanding of what they're doing politically and in the public sphere. So how would we actually have an empathetic understanding of that while being deeply troubled at the same time? And I'm just very puzzled by how one would do this.
Good. And Katinka?
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk, even though it's very dark, as somebody has already said. I'm interested in the corporatization aspect of what you were talking about. As you know, that is something that has been discussed on a number of different levels, and that's happening in field after field, not just in journalism, but in the academia, in politics, in art, and it's happening all over. So if I were to ask you, what do you think is special about the Indian case, and what do you think is part of a more general trend? That I would be curious to hear what you have to say.
Adyanta?
My questions have been asked.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I think that, I mean, you mentioned that the Kargil War episode was a brief episode when you could say that this kind of ultra-nationalist consensus in the media. But I think there are some others also, like, for instance, the coverage of most fake encounters and all of that as well, especially involving Muslims and all, have been really, really skewed. And even in states like Chhattisgarh, and also in a way, you know, all the newspapers there would mostly toe the state line. But one of the things I just wondered, in context of the US analogy, there's been a lot of talk in the US about the post-truth kind of thing, where social media is blamed for the proliferation of fake news and all of that. But would you agree that in India, I feel, it's my sense that it's the big media that is the main culprit here in establishing this, you know, these fake narratives and emotive, highly emotive, but extremely, you know, fake narratives built on complete lack of facts. And then sometimes it's fed by social media, but sometimes it feeds social media, I mean, both ways. But that big media has much greater reach there.
Good. Have I overlooked anyone? Okay. And that's
Actually,
the last
it is
question.
exactly the same question. I was just sort of struck in your presentation, and perhaps it's because you were trying to foreground the difference between the US and India in terms of the political economy of the business model, right? But there was a sort of, one got the sense that it was political economic necessity rather than ideological allegiances that was really driving some of these transformations. And I wondered about ideological allegiances. And the second thing is, sort of going off of Anu, and maybe Anand as well, I mean, does this sort of capitulation to this business model and then the kind of ideological convergence with the Modi government that follows, is that equally true for other vernacular media? I mean, you talked about the Hindi press, but what about other vernacular media that's not the Hindi press? I mean, does the scale of the operation matter to the extent to which there is this capitulation?
Right. Okay. Good. Ojo just added himself to the list. But,
There's clearly a tension between the cultural agenda and the institute, the corporate agenda, right? And they are two different agendas, no? Even if you think of the BJP and if you think of the media. So I'm just wondering, how do the two come together in the scary way that they've come together?
By cultural agenda, you mean of the BJP and RSS?
Yeah, the Hindutva agenda much more than, yeah.
Okay. You know, it used to be, in 98, for example, during Vajpayee's time, most media that supported Vajpayee and his initiatives were quite critical and quite wary of the cultural agenda, such as it manifested itself at that time. And there were examples, because you had a crazy HRD minister in the form of Murli Manohar Joshi, who was pursuing all kinds of things. But you know, media organizations made a distinction between the two. Under Modi, I would say that when it comes to your big channels, there is a tendency even to go along with the cultural agenda now, and not just to support the political initiatives. For example, I was shocked and appalled to see in Times Now, on Times Now channel, whole debate justifying pressure on a rationalist in Tamil Nadu, and with the provocative question that, are the rationalists provoking Hindus? This was the question the channel was putting out. Now you imagine that 3 rationalists have been killed over the last 3 years. Gauri Lankesh has probably been killed by the same bunch of people. And here you have a man in Tamil Nadu, probably, you know, under the shadow of impending assassination. And you can have a channel essentially frame it like this, frame a question like this. Or the same channel that anchor, you know, after the Amarnath bus attack, where it turned out that the driver who saved the passengers was Muslim. And, but no, that's not the point I wanted to make. Omar Abdullah, who was former chief minister, tweeted that the Home Minister of India should ensure the safety of Kashmiri students around the country so that there are no retaliatory attacks. Perfectly reasonable apprehension to have, because these things have happened in the past. This channel went after Omar Abdullah and the National Conference saying, are you saying that we Hindus, and he used that phrase, we Hindus, are like jihadists? So I would say that increasingly with these big channels, and the coverage of so-called love jihad, Times Now and Republic TV have embraced this completely atrocious case from Kerala, where an adult woman her marriage has been annulled, and Hadia case. And the Supreme Court ordered a counter-terror investigation into, you know, her marriage. And the 2 channels have embraced this nonsense idea of, and, you know, held this out and have tried to wheel out other examples of love jihad. So I would say that the corporate agenda and the cultural agenda, we are seeing evidence which is disturbing to me of media not being, you know, of actually embracing this agenda. And sections of Hindi press always did it. So Jagran, Ujala, Dainik Bhaskar, to speak of big newspapers in the Hindi belt, have always gone along with this kind of thing. And you see other examples. You know, recent video clips surfaced of a BJP woman leader slapping a Hindu girl for having a cup of tea with a Muslim boy. And so the slap got wide coverage, and you could say even people were outraged. And even the North Korean channels were constrained to say that this is a bad thing, right? Mm-hmm. But there was none of them devoted any journalism to asking the police why was the Muslim boy in this incident, who was just having a cup of tea with this woman, charged with obscenity? So there is a police case under Section 294 against this young man, and so that was completely. I think there is a sense in which the media is buying into the cultural agenda. Although I would say your large English papers don't, and the non-North Korean channels also will have pretty vigorous debates on some of these topics. But that brings me to your question. Ideological allegiance you see, say with Zee TV, with India TV, where the owner, the editor are politically aligned with BJP. Right? So Subhash Chandra is a member of Rajya Sabha supported by the BJP. Rajat Sharma makes no bones about his ideological and political affiliations. But when it comes to, say, other channels, or say a paper like Hindu, like why would the editor of Hindu say that, in reference to my case, and this is before the last election, the new editor of the Hindu said that, well, one of the reasons we asked him to go was because he was too critical of Narendra Modi. Right? So we know that the owners of the Hindu have no ideological love for Narendra Modi. That's very clear to me. But there is a sense in which you're looking at the political economy, the business writing on the wall, and you're going with the flow. So today I would say that the ideological allegiance factor is there, and it's probably more in the case of Hindi media, where many of the owners, the Jagran group owners, for example, openly are pro-BJP. Although they were also close to Samajwadi, because that was the government for 5 years in the state. But when it comes to English, I can't say that the owner of India today has any, Mr. what's his name, Puri, Mr. Arun Puri has any ideological affinity for RSS. But he's quite happy to have Aaj Tak, or Mr. Sameer Jain. Sameer Jain has no ideological affinity with anybody, quite frankly. But he's quite happy to have Times Now because it makes great, solid business sense. And I don't think, I would say the picture in the language media is perhaps equally bad, if not worse. And this is not true just of Hindi. My sense of Bengali, Assamese, Odia media, I can't say of Tamil or Malayalam, but I know that in many states, in Karnataka, for example, many states where the BJP has a very hard sell, you have media that is aligned with the BJP and that is quite happy to recycle garden variety communalism and a lot of the cultural agenda. And you see it in other ways, right? So Rohingya, portraying the Rohingyas as the biggest threat to Indian national security. Many of these people just go along with it, and you can see this, fear mongering happening. I didn't mention, but one of the disturbing elements is year after year giving, Doordarshan refused to broadcast the Chief Minister of Tripura's Independence Day speech because they said it had political content. But year after year, the RSS Chief Mohan Bhagwat's speech, including a very filthy one he made this Vijayadashami, attacking Rohingyas and all kinds of nonsense that he said, that was given live telecast on Doordarshan News, which is really something quite alarming. So I would say, role of English versus vernacular, are people undemocratic? I'm not sure about, and this question that you asked about whether why is it that Times Now and Republic are more popular? The truth is that we don't have any way of knowing this, quite frankly. I'm speculating based on the amount of advertising or so-called TRPs. But if you talk to the owner of NDTV or you talk to somebody like Jawahar Sarkar, who ran Prasar Bharati for 5 years, he says TRP is all rigged. And it has no bearing whatsoever. And in fact, this is the case. It is subject to a lawsuit actually right now as to how the design of this, how you measure popularity. But I will grant that they do have the ability to move conversations among the upper middle class. And that's an influential section of society. And what they talk about, politicians pick up, and then it has a way of making its way through to other forms of media. But if I go just by objective numbers, we do a very popular program on The Wire with Vinod Dua called Jan Gan Man Ki Baat. Now, Jan Gan Man Ki Baat is a YouTube, it goes out on YouTube and on Facebook. And YouTube allows you to compare the number of views. It's a public number that they display. And there is no program on any Hindi channel, which is news and current affairs, which attracts as many views every day as Vinod Dua. Like now he's clocking for each of his programs about 140,000, 150,000 YouTube views. In Facebook, it runs into lakhs. And there's nothing that Z puts out, nothing that Aaj puts out, not even Ravish, who's very popular, matches those numbers. So I would say that actually we don't know, what is popular, what it is that people want. I think people, when they're given an alternative, will gravitate towards it if it speaks wisdom, if it speaks truth and honesty. And certainly the response that somebody like Vinod Dua is getting tells me that there is. I'm not pessimistic about what people want. I think the issue can be design dissemination methods that allow. So we are quite happy. We often find out that our videos have been ripped off and people are putting them up on Facebook as their own or on WhatsApp. We don't care. We say, because we're not doing it we don't get profit from eyeballs necessarily, right? So we say, okay, just do it, circulate it, it's fine. So I wouldn't worry too much about that part. And I wouldn't say, I don't accept that Arnab Goswami is giving what people want. I think that some people may want it. I know that his sponsors and owners want it, definitely. And this is a channel owned by a MP of the government. And this is what he wants, that's for sure. But I'm not sure that this is necessarily what, so this may be my own hope. But we have no statistical way really of knowing this, quite frankly. The question of corporatization, you see, media is increasingly corporate controlled. I mean, TV18, the Ambani Group it owns TV18, it owns CNBC in India. It has a controlling stake through debt of NDTV, actually. But its control and its influence extends beyond mere ownership. So even before it became a direct player, I remember when I was editor of The Hindu back in 2012, 2013, lots of news was coming out from the oil ministry of how the Ambani Group, Mukesh Ambani Group was, they had this big gas project, KG Basin, and how the government felt that they were being ripped off by the Ambanis because he was gold plating a lot of his costs and then paying less royalty to the government. So these documents were getting leaked, and apart from us and Business Standard, which is a business paper, nobody would touch those papers. So maybe they were afraid of lawsuits or whatever it is, but they had influence over that, and it mirrors. I mean, politics is the role of big money in politics is much more today than it was 15 or 20 years ago. So I would say that these are all kind of worrying. They're all worrying trends. The 9/11. Who mentioned the 9/11 example? That's right. Yeah. I agree. I mean, I would say, in fact, if my supposition is, if my political economy explanation of business attitudes playing a role in creating comfort space for media plurality is correct, just like U.S. corporate sector is divided over Trump, they were not in the run-up to the Iraq War. They were all lined up behind the Bush administration in terms of wanting to go to war, and so that was reflected in the attitude of all your big papers. So that gives us a clue actually that of the various factors that I identified, which is the attitude of big business, the nature of your state institutions, and internal media integrity. It's the political economy of big business, that which is probably the most important factor. But when you have a division within the corporate sector, that creates space which allows all the other factors to play. Kavita, you're right. See, the thing is that the ills of media in India are legion, and I would say that as with even the US, for example, coverage of so-called national security matters tends to follow the official line. Journalists, it takes some courage and some integrity to deviate from the party line or the government line when it comes to counter-terror and all of this kind of thing, where you have or it's very difficult to develop independent sources of information. So people tend to go along with what, and there you're right, and the media has been particularly craven and has been craven for a long time. I would say going back even before the current crop. So anti-Muslim fake encounters are really, they are the product of the Advani era. I would say you go back 15, 20 years before to a lot of the counter-terror operations in Punjab in the 80s and early years of, you had the same cravenness of media coverage, which is the problem. But I would say that, you know, that was part of a phenomenon which is in many ways universal, that you know, media tends to follow when it comes to, you know, internal security matters. But today what we have is something quite different. On fake news, you're right. I mean, the problem is that it's not your Breitbarts that are pumping out fake news, or your obscure Bulgarian websites that are, you know, routed through servers and then seen by people on Facebook. It's your mainline big channels, big papers that are fabricating news, or even if they're not fabricating, they are talking up certain kinds of issues and creating, you know, controversies where none ought to exist, or spinning something in a certain way that is very beneficial to the ruling party. And I think this is the biggest cause of worry right now. I think I've covered pretty much all the questions. Yeah.
Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now we break for coffee for some 15 minutes. Vi kom litt sent i gang.